Oh, hello everyone. My name is Tracey Reed. I'm a holistic nutritionist, and I'm here today to go through a stew recipe with you, talk a little bit about some of the health benefits, and we'll look at both a plant-based and an animal-based version of the stew today. Before I do that, let me tell you just a quick little bit about myself. So I'm a nutritional practitioner. I do have a clinical practice. I see people one-on-one. I am also a cookbook author of a cookbook called Histamine Haven. And I do teaching, I do presenting, obviously here presenting to you today. So I have my fingers dipped into a few different pots when it comes to nutrition. So having said that, let's get started on this stew. So I'm going to change my camera angle and I'll probably go back and forth a little bit, but I'd like you to see my cooking surface and what's happening there, and I'll talk to you as I go through all of this. So we're doing this hearty herb-infused stew today. And it's, you know what, I'm going to come back up for a second. It is extremely, extremely versatile. And this is one of the things I love about stew, is that you can play around quite a bit with quantities, with different ingredients, and you're still going to get something absolutely delicious. So we're doing a stew today because we're starting to move into the fall season. And right now, if you were to go to a farmer's market, you're going to see an abundance of root vegetables, of things like cabbage and squashes. And so we want to take advantage of this beautiful harvest that's coming in right now and utilize some of these local ingredients that we have. Also, we are just a few months away from the holiday season. And, you know, if we're looking at Thanksgiving, that's obviously coming up in a few weeks, which is hard for me to believe. I can't really believe we're already where we are in September. So this would also be really ideal for Thanksgiving, for holiday meals. And I'll talk to you a little bit about some of the holiday options when we look at replacing some of the ingredients. Again, this is really versatile, so you can do a lot of different things with this. Okay, now I think I'm ready to come down to my cooking area. So I've got my computer in there a little bit. You don't want to see that necessarily. You should all have the recipe. So I've got mine just laid out in front of me. And I am going to actually start. I'm just going to pop behind the camera here for just a second, or behind me, because the first thing I need to do is get avocado oil heated in my pot. And I will tell you, this is like, I'm just using a stock pot, a nice big pot. I usually use my Instant Pot, which is a pressure cooker. I'm not going to do that today because I want to be able to show you what's in the pot and how it's changing as it cooks. But Instant Pots are brilliant and they make life really, really simple. So I'm just going to start by putting my avocado oil into this pot. And I will just start by saying I have absolutely no affiliation with this brand chosen, but this is the avocado oil that is my preferred one. I have tried other brands. They often are rancid. They taste absolutely disgusting when they're rancid. So this is one that I trust, and it's available in most grocery stores, so it's easy to get. Now, avocado oil is an omega-9, so it's high in omega-9s, which is the same as olive oil. So these are healthy omega fats that are beneficial. So we're just going to put 1 tablespoon into this pot, and I'm just going to get that heating so that we can start to saute. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is saute our onions. Now, I know a lot of people don't like to cut onions, myself included, because your eyes can start to tear up. So I'm going to tell you, the less you cut your onion, the less likely you are to tear up. So this is another great thing about stew, is you can make things nice and chunky. You don't have to cut things finely. So we're just going to do, I'm going to do 3 cuts in one direction across my onion and 2 the other way. So again, nice big chunks. And I'm just going to toss that behind me into that cooking pot. Now, if you really find that you tear up excessively with onions, I know this is going to sound weird, but don't even cut it. Stick it right into the pot. It will become soft enough and start to break apart on its own. So that's another great thing. I wouldn't do that with any other recipe, but for stew, it actually works. Okay, so that is just going to saute behind me for a couple of minutes. And next we're going to get our garlic ready. Now, garlic and onion both have incredible health benefits, but garlic in particular does. It's antiviral, it's antifungal, it's antimicrobial. So for colds and flu season, garlic is a really, really lovely addition to use in all of your dishes. Now, if you look at the recipe, it says you can mince it or you can grate it. I grate it all the time because it is really, really fast and simple. And it has just simplified my kitchen routine quite a bit. So I'm using this micro grater. This is a grater that you would typically use for something like lemon zest. So it's quite fine. And I'm just going to grate my garlic. And the recipe calls for 2 to 3 cloves. And what happens is that this is actually just collecting on the back side there. So it's then very, very easy to scrape off with a knife. I'm just going to keep letting my onion saute for another minute or 2 while I continue to get this garlic grated. And this is super fragrant. You know, garlic is always just so lovely to add to dishes. Okay, so that is, there we go. We've got a nice pile of it there. I'm going to actually pull the pot over now because the next step is very simply adding the rest of our ingredients. So I've got the pot here. I'm just going to use my knife to get all of that garlic in there. Now, garlic, I find it does burn to the bottom of pans quite quickly, which is why I just like to give it a quick, this is still hot enough for me to do this, a quick saute for a minute, 2 at most. You just want it to become fragrant. And I can already smell this is wafting up. So that's lovely and ready. I'm just going to move this. It's a little bit hot here, but I'm going to move it next to my cutting board. Okay. Now, normally I would keep this on the stovetop, but just so you can see what I'm doing here as we go along, I'll have it next to me. Now, the next thing we're going to add is our liquid ingredient, and you have several choices for this. So on the recipe, I've indicated a stock or a broth or strained tomatoes, and I'm going to just talk you through these. So let me pull this up here while I talk to you about this. So a stock is easy to make at home. And I'm going to start talking about chicken stock as an example. And then I'll go through some different options just so you understand the difference between a stock and a broth. I think the culinary world uses those terms a little bit differently than the nutrition world. So I'm using the nutrition terminology here. So a stock is when you cook meat in the water and then you're using that water as your soup base. So in this case, we're using it as a stew base. So for example, if I were to take a big pot, put a whole chicken in that pot and cover it with water, and I would let that simmer for maybe an hour and a half, that would be a chicken stock. So the juices from the meat are going to run out and go into that water. So that's a stock. A chicken bone broth is different from a stock. A chicken bone broth is going to use the bones. So usually that's the carcass. So after the butcher has cut all the meat off, you would put that carcass into the pot. Some people will add additional bones, maybe some chicken feet, for example, cover that with water, and the broth cooks for a very long time over low heat. So people will do this in a slow cooker to get it into really low heat. They'll cook it from anywhere from 24 to 72 hours. Now, the difference between the stock is really getting the juices out of the muscle meat, some of the connective tissue like the skin and the joints. And with a bone broth, the nutrients are coming out of the bones themselves. They're both very, very similar. They have a similar flavor profile. The bone broth will be a little bit higher in minerals because you're extracting the minerals from the bones. The chicken stock is one of the most anti-inflammatory types of stock you can make. It's really, really high in some key amino acids, things like proline and glycine that are really anti-inflammatory and very soothing to the gut lining. So for that reason, stock is my favorite option, and that's what I'll be using today. You can also use a vegetable stock, and a vegetable stock is just a pot full of vegetables covered in water and cooked to get the flavor and the nutrients out of those vegetables. So regardless of what you like to use, these are all, well, depending on where you live, I was about to say they're all commercially available. Bone broths have become very, very popular in recent years. So you can often find bone broth in the freezer section at your local grocery store. The stocks are a little bit harder to find. Here in Calgary, where I'm at, I think I only know one company that actually does stock. And then, of course, you can get Tetra packs or pre-made broths or stocks. So this brand, this is Pacific Foods. This is a chicken broth. The main thing to look for if you're buying a pre-packaged commercial broth or stock is go to the ingredient list and see that you recognize the ingredients. You want to make sure there's no sugar in your stock or broth. So this one is good. There's a bone broth called Kettle and Fire that is really, really good quality as well. But as I said, I'm using homemade chicken stock today, and I've had it heating on the stove just to fast track things a little bit. So here's this is homemade. I always have homemade chicken stock just because it's one of those things that I kind of do routinely. And so this is just a plain, super, super plain chicken stock made using the whole chicken. And this is a liter. That's going to go right into my big pot. Now, again, you can use a vegetable stock for that. And then alternatively, on the recipe, it mentions strained tomatoes. So this is one example of strained tomatoes. So this happens to be an organic one. And I'm just going to take a minute and talk to you a little bit about why strained tomatoes versus canned or whole or, chunked tomatoes. There's many different ways you can buy tomatoes. So as a nutrition practitioner, one of the key things that I'm very mindful of is inflammation. And there's many, many things that cause inflammation: stress, sugar, lots of environmental factors. So with food, we want to use food in a way that is going to be anti-inflammatory. Now, tomatoes contain something called glycoalkaloids. And these can be inflammatory for some people. And so those compounds are found predominantly in the skin of the tomatoes and in the seeds of the tomatoes. So this is why I like a strained tomato, because this does not contain the skin or the seeds. And tomatoes have also been really, really well researched for a bioflavonoid called lycopene. So if you've ever read anything about lycopene, tomatoes are really high, particularly when they're cooked. So it's more bioavailable. That means your body can absorb it better and use it when it's cooked. So strained tomatoes, if you want a tomato base to your stew, this is what I would recommend using. Now, the recipe calls for 1 liter. This particular bottle is only 700 milliliters, so then I would add an additional 300 milliliters of water. I'm not going to use this today, but I am going to show you a recipe I already made later on that did use that particular ingredient. So we've got our garlic and our onions in the pot now. We have chicken stock is what I've chosen to use today. So the chicken stock is in there. And then next on the recipe is salt. Now, I've become a little bit finicky with salt just really, really recently. And so the salt I have here, this is actually, I purchased this in bulk. I just happen to use this container. This is a Himalayan salt. We're finding microplastics in our sea salt. So our oceans, unfortunately, are full of all of these plastics. And so a lot of our sea salt is containing these microplastics as well. And just being a nutrition professional, I like to feed my family with the cleanest foods I can. So I'm choosing now a Himalayan salt. Redmond's salt, which you can often find in grocery stores as well, is also a mineral-based rock salt as opposed to a sea salt. So we're going to do 2 teaspoons into our pot. So that is our salt. And then we're going to add some turmeric. Now, turmeric I also buy in bulk, so I've just put mine into, actually this is a supplement jar. Turmeric is brilliant. So let's just have a look at this, right? If you aren't using turmeric in your kitchen, it is incredible. It has so much research behind it. So this is a root, it looks very similar to ginger, very, very vibrant orange. It does lose some of its vibrancy as it's dried, but this has incredible anti-inflammatory properties. And so we're going to put a teaspoon of that into our stew. It's a lovely flavor, and this is just going to help give us some of the antioxidants and anti-inflammatory compounds. Next up is our meat. Now, on the recipe, I've indicated beef or lamb. Today, I'm actually going to use yak meat. So any kind of stewing meat will work. I just happened to be at the farmer's market this week, and they had some yak meat that was stewing meat. So this is already cut up into little bite-sized pieces, as stewing meat is. And so 2 pounds of that are going to go into, sorry, this bag's leaking a little bit. So let me tell you a little bit about yak. It's a really nice lean meat. It's very much like beef, but I would say a little bit leaner than what you might get in your typical beef stewing meat. I think is being increasingly raised across Canada. So we have local yak producers. And it's just a very lovely lean meat. So that's gone into our pot. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit about lamb as well, because the lamb is just brilliant. I'm going to chat with you here for a minute. So if you were to choose lamb, you actually wouldn't even need a stock. So lamb is just this really rich, hearty meat, and it does tend to be a little bit fattier than other meats. And so that little bit of fat will go into the water. It really almost creates a stock for you. So you can make a stew just with water if you want to use lamb. I find lamb this is where sort of the holiday season comes in. It's a little bit more expensive. But for the holiday season, if you're looking for a nice treat, a lamb stew is just divine. I have to say, it is probably my favorite stew of all time. So that, know that if you're doing lamb, you can certainly still use a chicken stock or any other kind of stock, but you actually don't have to. It's just such a lovely, lovely meat to work with. Okay, next up, so we've got our meat in there. And I forgot, I just realized this morning. You'll notice on the recipe it says 4 carrots, and I forgot to indicate what to actually do with your carrots, but we're just going to cut them into bite-sized pieces. So if you happen to have your recipe in front of you and you happen to have a pen nearby, then I would just write for the carrots and the parsnips to cut into bite-sized pieces. So that was my error. Now it says 4 carrots on there. I have smaller, these are fresh seasonal carrots. They're a little bit smaller than the average kind of grocery store carrots. So I've got 6 here today. I want to talk to you about whether you want to peel your carrots and parsnips or not. It is really entirely up to you. So today I've done both. I have left my carrots unpeeled, but I have peeled my parsnips in advance. It's really, for aesthetic reasons, you may decide you want them peeled. It looks a little bit nicer, but you don't have to. And if it's going to save you time and energy not to, then don't peel them. Just give them a quick wash, which is what I did before we started here today. So these, again, just bite-sized pieces, really, really simple to do. And we're going to get those in. And you know what? I think I'm actually going to get this pot back on the stove while I continue. Just so we can get that cooking. Now, next up is parsnips, and I want to talk to you a little bit about parsnips. So I've got 3 here today. I chose 3 instead of 2 because they were a little on the small side. When I went to the store, these were literally the last 3 parsnips on the shelf. So what do you do if you want to make a stew and one of the ingredients isn't available at the store? Well, you can really replace parsnips or carrots even with any root vegetable. And so, for example, you could grab a turnip, you could grab a rutabaga, you could grab celeriac, and I've got one here to show you. If you've never used celeriac before, this is a root vegetable, tastes like celery. This is not the root of celery, but it's a very, very similar plant. And it's got a little bit of a kind of bumpy surface, so it's a little bit of work to get that off. You can't peel it, you do have to use a knife. But this would be another option. Again, like I said, rutabaga, turnip, kohlrabi is really lovely. And I have used kohlrabi in the vegetarian version that I'm going to show you later on today. So parsnips are a little bit more interesting to cut because you get some like this guy that it's quite thin on one end, but can be quite thick on the other end. So one of my tricks, just to keep things simple, is I do this like little back and forth cut on the thick end. And then as I get to the other end, I just cut it the same way that I would the carrots. Get rid of my little ends there. So again, this is one of the great things about a stew is it's not dependent on fine chopping. It's just this really rough bite-sized chopping that does not take a lot of effort. So those are going into the pot as well. And the next ingredient is butternut squash, and it says peeled and cooked. So here is my strategy. Frozen. This saves you so much work. You don't have to peel, you don't have to cut. It says 300 grams on the recipe. This package is close enough. It's 284 grams. And it's close enough. This is the other thing with stews. You don't have to be super fixated on exact quantities. You can buy also, so this brand is Stahlbush, but you can go into Superstore. Superstore always has large bags of frozen butternut squash. It is such a versatile ingredient. I always have it in my freezer. So I love frozen squash because it just saves all of that time prepping. So this is what it looks like already cubed for you. This is going into my pot. So that was quick and easy. Now we've got mushrooms. Now it says 3 cups. I actually tend to weigh my mushrooms. So I've got them in my little scale here. I just find mushrooms come in so many different sizes. It's a little bit easier to weigh. So mushrooms are a little bit finicky sometimes to clean. You don't want to submerge them in water because they'll actually soak up a lot of water. You just want to give them a quick rinse, which I've already done. And then the ends can get quite woody and tough. So you just want to get those off. Now, I've prepped most of mine already. It says in the recipe to have them. You actually don't need to do this. I find this is a nice bite size. It also depends on your mushroom size. So this little guy, I am going to keep whole. I'm just going to get that little woody end off. If you go to a grocery store, you will often see that you can get sliced mushrooms. So those are already sliced for you. And you can also get those to save yourself the preparation. So anywhere that we can make things easier, that is always desirable and a good option. So again, I've cut most of mine in half. I've left some of the smaller ones whole. I didn't have a really big one today, but if I get really big ones, I'll quarter them. And so the mushrooms also just go into the pot. Now, I really like mushrooms because they have a nice earthy flavor. And mushrooms are also rich in something called beta glucans. And beta glucans are, they give us some of these medicinal properties that mushrooms can impart. And we don't get a lot of that with our standard button mushrooms, but certainly there are mushrooms that are more medicinal. But mushrooms I like really, again, for that sort of earthy flavor that they provide. If for some reason you don't tolerate mushrooms or don't like mushrooms, I know some people don't like them because of the texture. They don't like they find it a little bit too slippery. You could replace them with potatoes instead. Potatoes also have that earthy flavor. I just like mushrooms. I think we don't tend to eat them too much, so this is a really nice way to get them in. And again, I find for celebratory stews, you know, it's kind of a nice option. Now, the last thing we have on the ingredient list is herbs. And I went out into my garden. I still have fresh herbs out in my garden. And so I have some rosemary, some oregano, and some thyme. Now I'm going to show you a little cheat with herbs. If you're using dried herbs, by all means, you can do that. Italian blends would be nice in a stew, or an herb de Provence would be a nice blend. Any sort of dried blends, or if you just have oregano, thyme, grab some of those. So for dried, you would use about 1 tablespoonful. But if you have fresh, and you can often get packages with these mixed herbs, they'll call it a poultry blend. But it's a lot of work to pull off all these little leaves, especially for the thyme. You can try to strip them off, but I can't be bothered, quite frankly. So here's my cheat. I'm going to use a little bit of kitchen twine. And here, I'll move the camera down again so you can see this. But all I'm going to do is I'm going to tie my herbs into a bundle. And I'm going to throw the whole bundle into my stew. And what's going to happen as my stew cooks, the leaves will just fall off. They'll soften and fall off the stems. And rather than have to go in and individually pick out the stems, now it's all bundled up and I can just pull the stems out in one go. So this is going into my pot. So everything is now in that pot. I'm going to cover it and we're just going to let it simmer there. And hopefully, I don't think it will be completely done by the end of the session, but hopefully it will be done enough that you can see what it looks like. So with that 1 liter of stock in there, the vegetables are mostly covered, not entirely covered. And that's kind of exactly where we want it to be. So that's going to simmer away. One thing I'm going to tell you right away is that butternut squash is actually going to soften enough that it's going to break apart and dissolve. And what that's going to do is give that stock a thicker consistency. So that's desirable. That's what we want. We want that nice kind of thick deliciousness. And so you won't actually see the squash in there once the stew is completely done. Okay, while that is cooking, I'm going to talk to you about a vegetarian version of stew, because you may not be a meat eater, and what are you going to do instead of what we've just done? So I have prepared a version, and I'm just going to grab it. It's sitting here behind me. This is what my vegetarian version looks like. And I'm just going to talk you through what I did to create this. So I used lentils in this particular version. So if you look on the recipe, right above the picture of the stew, it says vegetarian variation. And so instead of the 2 pounds of meat, you're going to use 1 cup of lentils. Now, I used these red lentils. And you might be saying, well, Tracey, could I use chickpeas or kidney beans or some other type of bean instead? And I actually have a preference for lentils. So this is from a health perspective. So all legumes, so legumes is this family of all of these beans, kidney beans, cannellini beans, chickpeas, blue-eyed peas or black-eyed peas. All of these different types of beans and lentils are part of the legume family as well. They are quite high in something called lectins. And lectins directly contribute to leaky gut or intestinal permeability, if you've ever heard either of those 2 terms. And when you have a chronic lung condition, you also have that permeability in your lungs. And what we tend to see in the body is that that permeability doesn't exist in isolation. It exists throughout the body. So for example, if you have permeability in your lungs, it would be expected that you would also have permeability in your gut. So lectins contribute directly to gut permeability. And again, if we can reduce gut permeability, then hopefully we can mitigate some of the lung permeability as well. So when we're talking about permeability, I'm going to use my hands. If you can imagine my hands as cells, and cells actually have these protein structures between them, and they hold the cells together, and that creates a nice strong barrier. But when you have this permeability or the leakiness, those structures have opened up, and that allows things to leak from your lungs into your body or your gut into your body between the cells. So for those of you who haven't heard of leaky gut before, or permeability in some of these tissues, that's what I'm talking about. So I know that's a very long-winded story, but going back to my choice of lentils, lentils out of all of the legumes have the lowest lectin content. So I specifically created this recipe using lentils instead of other legumes. So 1 cup of lentils to replace the 2 cups of meat, and then you need to add an additional cup of water because these are going to soak up a lot of water. Otherwise, the stew recipe is exactly the same. I used all of the same ingredients, except this is where I used the strained tomatoes. And this is actually a really, really lovely pairing. I find lentils need a little bit of a sour note to go with them. And so the strained tomatoes provide that. So this is a really nice flavor combination, and they work wonderfully together. So I used the strained tomatoes instead of the chicken stock and the lentils instead of the meat. And it just so happened that when I made this particular stew, there were no parsnips at the grocery store. So I used a kohlrabi for this particular version. So let me just highlight the kohlrabi in here so that you can see it. It's these big pieces right here, and it's very, very similar in consistency to other root vegetables. It has a really neutral flavor profile. So that, again, is just an example. If you can't find parsnips at the grocery store, you can almost always find the other ingredients, but that might be one that's a bit trickier. So just use another root vegetable in its place. So that is our vegetarian version. Now, let me talk to you a little bit too about what to serve these with. Sort of as a base to the stew. You can have the stew on its own exactly as is. But the meat stews are really, really lovely served with something like mashed potatoes. And because this particular recipe doesn't have potatoes in it, that can be a really nice option. So to serve it with some mashed potatoes, maybe put some mashed potatoes in the base of your bowl and then pour the stew right on top of it, for example, or serve it on the side. You can also, so for the vegetarian version, I would actually recommend that you serve this one with white rice. And the reason is that to get your complete protein, so as a vegetarian, you always need to be mindful you're getting all of your amino acids. So you would want to pair this with white rice. And I say white rice versus brown rice because just as with the lentils, brown rice has a high lectin content. And we don't necessarily want a lot of lectins in your diet. So white rice is one of the lowest lectin grains. So this would be really, really lovely with white rice. The other thing that I really like, and I don't have a sample of it here with me today, but cauliflower rice is really lovely. Sometimes it's called riced cauliflower. So it's just chopped up, finely chopped up cauliflower. And you can saute that in a big frying pan with more avocado oil or ghee, butter, whatever your favorite cooking fat is. And it's really lovely if you're trying to go low carb, then riced cauliflower is a really, really nice option. You could get, if you happen to have a Costco membership, at Costco, they have these bags of organic riced cauliflower in the freezer section, and it's a big bag, and within that bag are 4 smaller bags. So we always have that in our house. My youngest son loves it, and it's super easy for him to just open up a package and throw it into a frying pan. So riced cauliflower, again, especially if you're going low carb, that is a really, really nice base as well. So those are some options for having with the stew itself. I'm going to bring the pot over and we can have a little look at how the stew is progressing. So let's get our camera angle ready. Okay, so this is bubbling away here. I'm just going to give it a little stir. So yeah, everything's getting soft now. And I'm expecting, the squash is already starting to fall apart. So that's exactly what we want. Like I said, that's just going to help thicken up that liquid for us. So this is coming along really nicely. And, you know, our meat is starting to cook. One of the things with stew meat is it does need a bit of a longer cooking time because it does tend to be a little bit firmer, not a tender cut. So this is a really great way to tenderize that meat. Okay. I am going to, Shane, are we able to open things up for questions for those people who are live?
Yes, we can. They can comment in the box. They can't actually talk.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, so for those of you who are watching live, if you have any questions, please feel free to go ahead and put those in the chat, and I'll do my best to answer your questions. I want to, while we're waiting for questions to come in, I want to talk to you again a little bit about the versatility of this recipe and some of the ways you can swap things out. So we've already talked about parsnips. If you can't find parsnips, then any root vegetable will do, is going to be a really, really good option. We've talked about some of the different liquid bases. We've got the chicken stock, the bone broths. Again, chicken stock, I do really, really like. You've heard me now talk about lectins in lentils and rice, how they do contribute to gut permeability, and that chicken stock is probably the best food that we have to repair that permeability. Okay, first question. Oh, no. Okay, did you say lentils were good to add as they were? Okay, so lentils, yes. Lentils you can add exactly as they are. With larger beans, they do require soaking in advance, but lentils, you just need to rinse them. So if you put them into a fine strainer or sieve, you can rinse them and be mindful that sometimes there's little rocks in there, and you want to make sure you kind of just do a quick check and pull out any of those. Yes, they are high in lectins. And yes, white rice is low lectin. So a lot of people will always ask me, like quinoa, right? We think quinoa is going to be really great. They're like, is quinoa going to be a good choice? Quinoa is actually very high in lectins as well. So my first choice is always white rice. And I know we hear so much about fiber, and people in the Western world think that brown rice is better because of fiber content. But if you look all around the world and look at all the countries that have historically eaten rice, there's a reason they chose to eat white rice over brown, and it was the health impact. And so white rice is going to be my first choice. Another really, really good option is millet. If you like millet, if you've ever tried it. Now, millet as a grain, it goes from grain-like to mushy a little bit easier than rice does. So that's one downside to cooking with millet. I feel like it makes a really lovely porridge. It does a beautiful polenta as well, but I wouldn't necessarily use it for something like a stew. So white rice is my first choice for this. Okay, I feel like I've missed a few questions. Let me just backtrack here. Okay, Pat is asking, where do we find the recipes? So Pat, my understanding is that the recipes have been sent out to you. Shane, are you able to pop in and clarify?
Yeah, when you registered, whatever email you use, the recipes went that way. So,
Yeah.
but if Pat, if you just comment with your email, I'll make sure you get another copy. It might be in your spam folder as well.
Thank you. Okay, any other questions coming in? Otherwise, I'll just go back to my conversation on replacements. Okay, so I'll keep my eyes posted for more questions. So liquids, we've talked about the chicken stock, the bone broths. We've talked about the tomato puree. The strained tomatoes, rather. You can also use the strained tomatoes in a meat-based stew, which is really, really nice with lamb, actually, as well. With these stews, the recipe is laid out for you, but you can be really, really flexible with quantity. And so even if you go to your fridge one day, you're like, you know what, I know I've got stew meat in my fridge or freezer. I'm just going to go to my fridge and see what I have. You can literally use almost any vegetables in a stew. So if you had celery, you can chop up celery and use it in the stew. If you have, I know it's going to sound weird, but even radishes you could use. We don't really use radishes in a cooked way in North America, but they're quite lovely roasted. So you could use something like radishes as well. Open up your freezer if you have frozen vegetables, and it's going to make it easier if you don't have the energy to be chopping vegetables, then please utilize frozen vegetables as well. So this is really, really versatile. I've kind of put my favorites into this particular recipe. Okay, we've got a couple of questions. Okay, what about beans, green, yellow, kidney beans, chickpeas? Chili is a less favorable meal. So again, these beans, from a lectin perspective, this is sort of the one problem with beans. So I've spent the last few years really doing a deep dive into the bioavailability of nutrients. And I've really moved more and more towards meat, because the nutrients in meat, our body can get those really, really easily. And with beans, not so much. So you could certainly use beans instead of the lentils. Again, lentils still have lectins. Beans have more lectins. I'm just going to really, really quickly, for those of you who are vegetarian, if you're going to use beans, the best thing to do is give them a really, really long soak beforehand, and then give them a really good rinse to help get those lectins out. The longer you soak, the more of those lectins you're going to get rid of. So if you want to use beans, you certainly could, and that would be the most preferred way to do that, to get rid of some of those lectins. But chili, yeah, if I were to say like chili versus stew, I would go for stew bar none. Like it's stew, soups and stews, because we're utilizing, especially if we're utilizing a chicken stock, but if we're utilizing a bone broth or a stock, it is so soothing to your gut. It is soothing to the entire digestive tract. The nutrients in stew are really, really easy to absorb. And this is why I love stew at this time of year and really throughout the entire winter. If you have a chronic health condition and you are here because you are one of the people with pulmonary fibrosis, then this type of food, soups and stews, are a really, really great way to nourish yourself. So I do really like them. Okay, Pat, you found the recipes. Brilliant. Okay, so this is a really, really versatile recipe. As I've said, I'm going to scoop out a bowl of the stew now so that you can get a good close look at what a finished stew looks like. Oh, I need my oven mitt. Okay, change the camera angle again. So here we have it. This probably needs just like another 2 minutes, but it is completely edible as is. So you can see there's really no visible squash left in there. So that's really just kind of dissolved into the soup, giving it that really lovely, rich color along with the meat juices. And we've got our parsnip and our carrots and our mushroom pieces are in there as well. So that is the finished product. And the turmeric that we utilized in here has also helped to give it that lovely, rich color that you see in the liquid portion. Now, I just want to compare this quickly to the vegetarian version. You'll notice the vegetarian version is a lot thicker. And that's because those lentils have really absorbed a lot of the liquid. So it's quite a different consistency. I happen to have, when I was putting this recipe together, I happen to have a house full of university kids. So I was having them taste test for me, which was quite lovely. So feedback was really good for both of them, but they did comment, oh, like they're completely different consistencies. So again, the stew is going to have a bit more of that kind of soup-based consistency, and the lentil stew is going to be a little bit thicker, but both are equally delicious. So I'm going to turn off, the bubbling's a little loud back here. Turn that off. Any last questions? We're getting close to the end of our hour, so I want to make sure that if anybody has any questions about the ingredients, the health benefits, the uses of stew. So again, we've talked a little bit about the holiday season coming up, fall coming, and all of these beautiful vegetables that are being harvested across Canada. We are so lucky in Canada to have an absolute abundance. We have amazing farmers in Canada. We have really great farmers. So we're just so lucky to have this incredible abundance of really, really good quality food available to us. So I hope that you'll check out your local grocery store. If you have a farmer's market nearby, also really, really great place to go support your local farmers, get some of these ingredients, talk to the vendors at farmers markets. because they really, really want to tell you what they're producing. So for example, yak, today I put yak into this stew, and yak, again, is a very lean meat. I've chatted with the producer who I get this yak from. So it's really nice to have that connection. If you enjoy going to farmers markets, that's just a really lovely way to connect with the food that you're putting on your table. Any questions? Again, last minute questions. So I hope you guys will enjoy this recipe. It is, for Thanksgiving coming up. Like, this is so much simpler than getting a turkey in the oven. I will be totally honest. I think I've only ever done a turkey twice in my life. They're just a little bit high maintenance. So this would be a really lovely alternative for Thanksgiving. With the holiday season approaching in December, regardless of what holidays you celebrate, I know there's so many in December. This is a lovely option if you're having people over to your home. This is also a lovely option to take to people's homes for, a potluck style event. Deb, you're saying thank you. I'm so glad you could join live, those of you who are here today. And for those of you who will be watching the recording, I'm glad you can be watching as well. So let me quickly, in the last couple of minutes here, just talk about budgetary considerations. Again, I used yak today, and that's probably sort of a mid-range meat from my local farmer's market. Lamb, again, is going to be one of the higher costing meat options. But again, if you want to kind of splurge for the holiday season, it's just my favorite. If you like lamb, a lamb stew is just divine. I know not everybody likes the taste of lamb. So, just a simple beef stew is probably going to be the most economic for you. Lentils, if you're vegetarian or you really like lentils are definitely going to be the most cost-effective way to make a stew. And because with vegetables, you can really swap things out. Again, if you're at the grocery store and something is on sale, go ahead and get it and use it in your stew. So a couple of little tips there for economizing. Generally speaking, this is a really great economic meal. Now, the recipe we've made today, it's quite large. I'm going to just show you the whole pot. So my pot's, this is a really big pot. I don't know how many liters. Sorry, changing camera angles always a bit tricky. But this makes like a hearty 6 servings. And so I consider a serving size to be about 2 cups. You can see my herbs in here. So that is, that's going to come out, right? That's my little herb bundle. And I'm actually going to just stir that in there first to get all the leaves off, and then I'll pull that out in a second. So this is a nice party-sized type of meal. And sorry, I don't want to forget to have got like 1 minute left. Really important conversation is freezing. You can freeze this as well. So if you have days that are up and down, some days you don't have a lot of energy. On the day where you have energy, make up a big pot of this stew, and then you can freeze it into 2 cup serving sizes. And if you don't eat that much, use smaller ones. But it freezes beautifully, and then to thaw, the meat one thaws really, really well on the stovetop in a pot. The vegetarian version I would thaw in the stove, just because it's a little bit thicker. It will burn a little bit not in the stove, in the oven. I would do it in the oven because on the stovetop it might burn a little bit. So it freezes beautifully, which means on the days where you don't have a lot of energy, you can pull a frozen serving size out and just get it into your belly on those days where you're too fatigued to be cooking. All righty, we have now wrapped up our stew session. Next week, I'm coming back to share a really, really simple, incredibly versatile cookie recipe, also brilliant for the coming holiday season. And I'm going to show you a whole bunch of different ways to utilize that recipe. So I hope to see you next week.